What's the overarching theme of the narrative? Well, there's a dereliction of discipling. There's the breached relationship. Watch what's being reported here in chapter 2. Look at chapter 2, Judges chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land, and the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen the great work of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. And then just 3 verses later, look at verse 10. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who didn't know the Lord or all the work that he had done for Israel. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. And thus they provoked the Lord. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and Astartes. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hand of plunderers who plundered them. He sold them into the hand of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Some tough stuff here, but we see some issues being played out. Major issues developed in the narrative are, 1, the grace and law tension. How God's holiness and justice interface with his promise and his mercy. And that's played out in the narrative of this relationship. The author also develops the conditionality and unconditionality of this relationship. And then there's this expression of sovereignty over the community. Yahweh was to be God and King. Chapter 8, 23. Gideon declares to them, reminds them that Yahweh shall rule over you. But this loosely knit tribal confederation would not likely become the kingdom of priests, the holy nation that God intended, without transformational leadership. And the narrative shows that these kinglets, these judges in a fragmented federation, would not lead to godliness. So the book of Judges sets the stage for the introduction of kingship. As we kind of wrap up our thoughts on the book of Judges, one of the things I think that just sort of shouts out from the pages of this historical narrative is that the faith community is always ever just one generation away from paganism. See, having godly parents doesn't guarantee godly children. Deuteronomy is challenging us as to what we should be passing on to our children. Are we doing it? If not, how do you start? Young people, what are your parents or faith community trying to do for you in your spiritual life that you're resisting? You see, God can and will raise up individuals to accomplish his purpose. I mean, God honors his word, even when it's in the hands of imperfect people, because God's compassionate toward his people. But his compassion is never a license to sin. God sometimes places us in circumstances where we've got to trust him. Gideon. Another lesson I think that we can draw from the book of Judges is to guard your relationships with the opposite sex. Samson. I think the book of Judges reinforces that God's word is the believer's standard. For the rest of the world, everyone's watch tells the right time in his own eyes. Think about it. Let's review briefly the little book of Ruth. God's providence and two remarkable people. I think the book of Ruth is a story of desperate testing and irrepressible hope. Key verses, Ruth 1, 16 and 17. Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And then over to chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. And the closest relative said, I can't redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. Then a few verses later, verse 17. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He's the father of Jesse, the father of David. Genre, you've guessed, we're still in theological history. The significance of the book of Ruth, it demonstrates in emotional ways, I think, God's faithfulness to the bottom line of the promise. It shows God's providence in salvation. I mean, Ruth graphically portrays this notion of redemption as buying back. Chapter 4, verses 3 through 10. This buying back, this redemption, called for a designated price to be paid by a redeemer who was related, a kinsman redeemer. Ruth illustrates the faith of a foreigner who adopts Yahweh. And it showcases this biblical notion of chesed. Catherine Dubs-Sackenfeld did, I think, a tremendous study on the meaning of chesed. And she traces it through the Pentateuch, through the historical books, to point out that it's more than loving kindness is. So many of our English translations choose to translate it. My problem with loving kindness is it reminds me of my grandmother. It carries, I think, for most folks, more of a sentimental notion than what clearly in the biblical narrative it points to as loyalty, steadfast love. Chesed always points to a provision for an essential need, never just a special favor. Loving kindness, a little nicety. It refers to an action performed by the situationally superior party for the situationally inferior party. And you see, the superior party, because of a more powerful status, is always free not to perform the act of chesed, but they choose to do so. The potential actor has a recognized responsibility to act in chesed because of the relationship that they have with the weaker party. Sackenfeld goes on to demonstrate that the superior party is normally the sole source available to render assistance to the party in need. So it's not just loving kindness, it's steadfast love, it's covenant loyalty. And wow, is that demonstrated in the book of Ruth. Structure, not terribly complicated. First 5 verses, the flight to Moab. They're refugees. Then beginning with verse 6 through the end of chapter 1, their return to Judah. Chapter 2, that scene of gleaning. And then chapters 3 and 4, the marriage. And here again, we have another example of an outlander being engrafted into this faith community. And this is the second one now that shows up in the genealogy of the promised son, the promised seed of Abraham. Check out the genealogies in the gospel, the genealogies of Jesus in the Gospels. There you have it. We'll see you in a bit.